Over to you, Alexis.
Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to UC GIS Week Day 3. You are in GIS and Society. And today we will have 3 incredible talks, 2 actually being done by undergraduates, which is amazing. So well done for you 2 coming out here and sharing your work. To start us off, we have Daniel Weinstein with his talk on the Eden Walk.
Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Yes.
Can you all see this?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to tell you all about a 21st century global odyssey that's known as the Out of Eden Walk. And I'm going to talk about how GIS is being applied to this project to make it meaningful to us, and also the ways that we've come to understand our world as it continuously changes. So this is an immensely vast project. It's nearly 10 years in the making, and it's probably going to be several years until it's completed, but it's going to leave us with a different perception of the interconnectedness of our world. So just to start out and give a little bit of personal introduction, my name is Daniel Weinstein, and I'm an undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara, and I'm studying geography with emphasis in geographic information science and sociology. Over the past summer, I worked as an undergraduate research fellow at the Center for Geographic Analysis at Harvard University. You can just call it CGA because I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but my mentor for this project was Jeff Blossom, who's a senior GIS specialist at the CGA, and he's been working on this project for a really long time. He actually made this map that I showed you all at this first slide, and he knows a lot of information about this project. So if you're interested in this project and you want to know more, I highly recommend you check out the CGA's website at gis.harvard.edu to learn more about this project and also other projects that Jeff and other members of the CGA have worked on. So the Out of Eden Walk itself began in 2013 by a journalist named Paul Salopek, who is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. And not that it's a surprise to anyone, but he's also a UC alum. And since 2013, he's been on a storytelling walk across the planet to enhance cross-cultural understanding through slow journalism and education. So this journey follows the path that our ancestors took to get from present-day Ethiopia through the Middle East, down to northern India, Eastern Asia, eventually crossing the Bering Strait into the Americas, and then traveling south all the way to the southernmost point of South America in Tierra del Fuego. One of the most authentic aspects of this project, in my opinion, is that the entire thing is being completed on foot. So Paul has already walked all the way from Ethiopia to Western China completely on foot, and he's going to continue walking all the way until he reaches South America. The only places that Paul won't walk are places where he actually can't walk, such as when he was forcefully evacuated at the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, which I'll tell you all a little more about later. But, also when he crosses the Bering Strait eventually, evidence suggests that our ancestors crossed this as a land bridge, but it's no longer crossable by foot today. So Paul's going to have to travel it through, flying or taking a boat over the Bering Strait. But despite that, the entire journey is also being logged by Paul himself in so many different forms that are allowing viewers at home like us to just understand the complexities of his journey a little bit better. Any information that he records, whether it's in the form of photos of the surrounding land or ethnographic accounts of the locals that he encounters, or even, a log of his encounters with the police, which I'll also show you guys later. All of this information is eventually being published to the Out of Eden Walk's National Geographic homepage for people like us to follow along with. And then, my job in all of this was ensuring that the spatial data was being published in an accurate way, or at least a way that's able to be modeled accurately and repeatably. And I also worked on enhancing the route with some in-depth information related to Paul's surroundings at each leg of the journey. So first of all, while Paul's on his journey, he keeps a GPS that tracks his location at discrete intervals, about 30 seconds apart. And then this data is then received by my mentor, Jeff, which allows us to make some spatiotemporal route calculations. Now, one of the big issues with the GPS data was that it wasn't always reliable because there were so many different portions of the route where Paul's GPS just lost signal or just wasn't able to transmit locational data for whatever other reason. And this led to some big gaps in our data that were sometimes several miles long. And I know what you might be thinking, if these gaps are only a few miles long and the entire route is going to be tens of thousands of miles, why does it matter that we have to fill in these gaps? Well, to answer your question, these might seem insignificant on a global scale, but it was also critical to our other calculations that the full extent of his journey is documented. So we wanted to fill in these gaps. So in these cases, what happens is Paul will reach back to us from wherever he is on his journey, and he gives us a detailed sketch of the route that he took to get through these missing portions. And that looks a little something like this. And then my job would be to go in and then geo-reference the sketch and trace them into ArcGIS. And this is in order to integrate it with the rest of the route and therefore, make the route continuous. And another troubleshooting calculation that we had to make involved figuring out the best way to approximate a precise distance that Paul traveled. And this is true, especially if we want to model a distance that's traveled on foot. And we absolutely want to do this because about every 100 or so miles that Paul travels, he publishes something called a milestone, which is like a detailed account of his surroundings. And you can kind of think of these as like a checkpoint, little checkpoints throughout his journey. So at each of these milestones, which are again about 100 miles spaced apart, Paul first of all captures a panoramic picture of his surroundings. You can see here at milestone 27 in Turkey, this is the panoramic picture. And then he also takes a picture of the ground and the sky. So it's kind of like, a little snapshot in time. And then he finds the closest local that he can to the milestone, and he asks them 3 questions. He says, who are you? Where do you come from? And where are you going? And again, you can find all of these at the Out of Eden Walk National Geographic homepage. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but these are all so interesting to look at. And I promise that if you do take some time to look at them, you'll be blown away. So I highly recommend you check it out. But the thing is, while these milestones occur at about 100-mile intervals, they're not exactly 100 miles spaced apart at a straight line distance. At milestone 80, National Geographic will estimate the route distance and display it as like 8,000 miles approximately, because that's exactly what his route distance would be if the milestones were exactly 100 miles spaced apart at a straight line. But in reality, we have to remember that our world is bumpy, and in many cases, it's only able to be traversed by moving in some crazy zigzag, like he had to do here in Lijiang. Whether he's going around the base of a cliff or he's going through a mountain pass, he needs to take some twists and turns. So these were concerns that the community followers of the Out of Eden Walk were actually sharing with us regarding the accuracy of its displayed information. So for all of these reasons, we wanted to calculate and then approximate a precise route distance. So the first thing we did was we converted the GPS points into multi-lines, and then we split them at each milestone. And then we calculated the distance of each multi-line based on the UTM grid that it lies in. And we did this so that we can account for variability in projection. And then this gave us a true distance, not only between the milestones, like these little dots right here, each representing a milestone, but we also got a true route distance for the entire route as a whole. So this was a really valuable calculation to make. And also, as one can assume, there were hundreds of times throughout the route where Paul just idled in one space, whether it's to take a break to speak with a local or to stop for meals and to sleep. As I said before, he's emphasizing slow journalism. So he's trying to stop as many times as he can to get an accurate read of his surroundings. So while this is a really important aspect of the project, a problem with it is that the GPS points created arbitrary points, and they showed up as these little messy clusters throughout the route, as you can see right here, which would lead to incorrect distance calculations because we didn't want to calculate the distance, including those times where he stopped, because we didn't feel that was should be calculated as part of his overall route. So for this reason, what I did was I selected and then I removed any line segments that were less than 10 meters in length. And this still left enough segments to show where Paul stopped along his journey, but it also gave us, a more accurate reading of his total distance. And overall, it didn't disrupt the continuity of the route. So you can see here, all this highlighted stuff right here is just any line segments that were under 10 meters in length. So when I deleted those, it still left this big one right here and this little cluster right here. So we could still see where he stopped and the route was still continuous, but we didn't have all this mess. And then it was also decided that showing precise times for where Paul was at literally each step of the way was also really important to this account. Luckily, the GPS points that we received were able to provide us with accurate times that were adjusted to the corresponding time zone. But in order to make a realistic interpolation of time at those, remember those missing route portions where we didn't have the values, what I had to do was create arbitrary points at about 10 meters of spacing from one another to fill in those missing segments. And then I manually populated each point with a timestamp that was averaged throughout the entire gap. And the point of fixing this error was so that online viewers could still receive an accurate estimate of Paul's location at any given time, without being left to guess or to make any calculations on their own. And, also it's to emphasize that idea of slow journalism. Once again, we want viewers to see that Paul is taking his time on these points, and he's not traveling this route as fast as he can. That's not really the point. His point is to interact with locals and get a better feel for his surroundings. So now, with most of the troubleshooting out of the way and precise times and distances calculated, I was then able to enhance the data that we already have with even more data that we got from Esri's Living Atlas portal. The point of these next enhancements was, first of all, to build intelligence around the Out of Eden walk route, but also we wanted to provide that element of realism for viewers who are keeping track of this journey at home. So the first route enhancement to the dataset was to add country attribute information. This was just a dataset of country borders. And by adding them and then splitting the route segments at these borders, what we could do is calculate the total time and the distance by each individual country. And then we also enhanced the GPS data with elevation information from a digital elevation model. So we used USGS shuttle radar topography mission data to extract its values to our points. And this data set has a spatial resolution of about 1 arc, or about 30 meters. Next, a land cover raster with the size of 10 meters cells was also added into ArcGIS. And what's great about this data set is that it classifies each portion of the Earth as belonging to one of 9 different land cover types, as you can see here. So we got water, trees, flooded vegetation, crops, built area, bare ground, snow, ice, clouds, and rangeland. So as Paul continues his journey, we can actually see how his physical surroundings have changed at each step of the way. And we can also see, where he's entered the built environment. So if you look at this red blob on the right side, this is where Paul is entering built area. So he's probably entering a village or a settlement of some sort. And then after that, he's just in cropland. So it's a really valuable estimate for where Paul is actually interacting with humans. And then we also enhanced the route with population density information at each step of the way. Population density was attributed to each route segment using a data set with a cell size of 10 meters. But the problem with this was that there were also places where the data just wasn't available at such a small extent. So we had to use a population density raster with just larger pixel size of 100 meters instead of 10 meters. And we used this to just patch in the data at the locations where we couldn't get population density at just 10 meters. Now, the thing with population density and land cover is that they're both temporally variable, but they're temporally variable on much shorter timescales than the other enhancements that we added, like country, slope, and elevation. And coincidentally, a really interesting feature with both the land cover and the population density data is that they're both time enabled. So we can actually interpolate values for population density and land cover by the year. So a goal by the very end of this project is to show population density and land cover as they both correspond to the date that Paul traveled at each location. So when we put all of these layers together, the attribute table looks a little something like this. This is the latest and greatest version of the data that we have, but it's still in a pretty raw form. So we have the date and the time, the latitude, longitude, the country, the elevation, the land cover, the population density, and the slope in degrees. And, eventually this data is going to make its way all the way over to National Geographic, where it can be shared for the public to analyze or inspect in any way that they'd like. And what's great about this project is also that the list doesn't really stop here, because there's so many other data sets that are being planned to add to this project. One of them is a data set of villages, towns, cities, and other territories around the world. And this will help us locate the nearest community of human life at each route segment. And of course, there's already so many other maps that have been produced by the CGA already. This is one of my favorites here. It's a map of police stops that Paul encountered. You see here we have our green points, our yellow points, and our red points. The green points represent friendly stops. So here at the Tajikistan-Afghanistan border, the police helped him carry his camping gear and they say, welcome back to Afghanistan. So everything's good there, right? And then we have our investigative stops here in Afghanistan. He was detained and then he waited an hour, but he was served some tea afterwards. So I guess it's not all bad. And then he has his more serious red stops, which is where he's, detained and arrested. Here at the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, this is what I was talking about earlier. He was detained while ascending from the Irshad Pass, and then he was evacuated from Pakistan all the way back to Abu Dhabi, where he was allowed back in Pakistan 5 days later to resume the walk. And why I use this example is because I think it does a really good job of showing, first of all, Paul's resilience to this route, because as soon as he was detained, he got back to the same place as soon as he could and continued his walk at the same place. But, it also shows his dedication to slow journalism and that element of authenticity. He wants to make sure that despite 21st century regulations, he's still going on this route and doing it to the best of his ability that's true to what our ancestors would have experienced. So finally, when spatial data enhancements like these are applied to the Out of Eden Walk, it makes it really valuable, not only to the people like myself and other members of the CGA who are working to enhance this data regularly, but also to the people that have been monitoring this project and watching along with it over the past 10 years. This puts them in a really immersive experience because not only can they see like those little snapshots of 100-mile milestones, but they can now see with this data everything that's going on in between them. And it gives them a greater understanding of like what Paul's going through at each individual step of the way, instead of, just at those 100-mile intervals. So I highly recommend you check out this project. It's so interesting to follow along with and watch. So if you're interested, I highly recommend these 3 links at gis.harvard.edu, also at natgeo.org/projects/Out of Eden Walk, and then also the project's official page at Out of Eden Walk Nonprofit.org. Thank you. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm happy to open up the floor.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Daniel. That was amazing. I want to see Zoom applause, please. Back to COVID time.
Yeah.
Yes. Incredible. So does anybody have any questions? You can either put them in chat or raise your hand, which I will try and grab. If not, I have questions. So let's see how much time we have left. We have a couple minutes. So this is a deeply human story and experience, right? You're like, this person's walking through landscape and interacting with people and then taking recordings of all these things that are happening and documenting them. So in the vision for the final map, are these videos and images and transcripts going to be like integrated into the final product? And then off of that, is there something that you wish the final product could have, but you can't really because of the constraints of, Esri software or any other software you'd be using?
Ooh. Oh, those are really good questions. Well, first of all, I don't want to say that there's going to be like one final map because there's so many different maps that are being made for this project. So I don't know even if they want to display all of these at the same point, because at a certain point it'll be out of our hands and we'll just hand it over to National Geographic and they'll have their way with it. But it's my hope that they'll display some images and some multimedia stuff, because I think that'll make the project really cool. And it'd be really cool if you can like click on a portion of the route and then see like some video information from like his nearby surroundings. That'd be really cool. And to answer your second question, I think that most of our constraints have to do with just the data that we don't have, if that makes sense. And I wish that we could just give an accurate representation of every single step of the way and not have to make any predictions. But the more we work at it, the closer that we can get to being at that point. And even if like Paul's not at that location anymore and there's nothing else that we can do, we can at least, consult with Paul and get a little more information and make the map a little more accurate.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
Great talk. Next up, we have Char Tomlinson from UC Berkeley in Studio Geo. Char, would you like to share your screen?
Totally. Let me just. Wonderful. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Char. I am a third-year undergraduate at UC Berkeley, working in a research lab we call Studio Geo with Clancy, Wilmott, and Alexis, as well as magnitude of other grad students and undergraduates. And I'm going to be talking today about a project that we're doing in conjunction with Sigorte Land Trust. There we go. All right, so context for the presentation today. Studio Geo is we're kind of like a lab that's working with a lot of different cartographic media, but also kind of contextualizing new media. And we've got some different projects going on within the Department of Geography at UC Berkeley, and as well as with kind of out of university groups such as Sigorte. So Sigorte Land Trust is, you may have heard of them, they've been kind of in the news lately as this urban indigenous women-led land trust based in the San Francisco Bay. So the folks in Sigorte are part of the Confederated Villages of Zheng, which is an Ohlone tribe. That ancestral homelands are kind of a ton of the East Bay, and then the Ohlone is like all around the Bay in general. And what Sigorte does is they are kind of leading this charge of returning, at least in the Bay Area, indigenous land to indigenous people, and specifically to indigenous women, with this kind of, there they are, context of being able to rematriate the land. So Sigorte, not only do they do land returns, right? So they are getting a lot of different spaces back from folks that live in the East Bay area. And they actually just recently got 5 acres of land in the Joaquin Miller Park from the city of Oakland. They also do a lot of different cultural revitalization projects. And then the land that they get back, they do a lot of kind of native plants. They also grow food, and they have a food bank, and they are kind of a part of this larger Bay Area community in using their forms of stewardship and their kind of like cultural revitalization tactics on those lands. And so they approached us about trying to, or at least they approached Clancy and Studio Geo, about trying to create a more detailed version, or kind of more like partial and specific to the Bay and the Ohlone version of Native Land CA, which I'm not sure if you all have seen this kind of mapping platform, and if someone wants to link it in the chat, that'd be lovely. It's a really large map that shows all of kind of the ancestral homelands of all these different indigenous groups throughout the world. And they were interested in kind of creating a localized version of that within the Bay Area, and with like their specific view, their specific cosmology as to kind of where their lands are and what they're doing with them. So they approached us about this, and we kind of had some different conversations and trying to figure out, okay, like what would be a good idea for this mapping project. And we came up with a couple different methods and ideas. So the first is creating a paper map that supporters might be able to buy and schools can use to understand more about Ohlone spaces. And then the second was to kind of jump into, okay, what would a digital map like this look like? And what would we, I'll get into it later, but how would we even go about creating a digital map like that in this kind of anti-colonial way? So first we'll start off with our paper map. So this is not the paper map. This is a kind of our first version of a map. This was like, okay, we're working together. We want to see kind of what this relationship would even look like, and if we can kind of be doing the things that Segorte wants. And what we kind of found is that this map already is somewhat of a it's different than many of the maps that you might see of indigenous territories, and specifically in the Bay. Kind of what we were talking about with these countering these noble savages like designs is that many of the maps that you see, they have this like depiction with kind of like natural earth tones and somewhat of like a historical archival like theme cartographically in their maps. And so, you know, without realizing it, you're looking at maps of indigenous territories, and it embarks this kind of this past moment, like a not really stating that these folks are still here. And so what we wanted to do and to just try out with Segorte was creating this first map that shows not only like their colors and the things that they are, because this kind of like teal and black is their kind of staple colors in their website and in their designs, but also showing the dynamics of some of the Bay, right? Like we have all of this different hill shade and kind of like understandings of these indigenous territories as present and here in the past and the present and the future. So trying to like learn what a map can even look like and kind of counter those historical maps of indigenous territories that just kind of, they don't create a sense of place and a sense of future in when you're looking at them. And so with Segorte, we kind of talked about some key considerations for this map, because we don't want to just make something using more, like in order to create a map that is like representative, right? We're not wanting to be using colonial tools in that process. So an example of this is talking about Segorte with projection and orientation. So these are kind of like demands and things that they want, right? So we've got, when it comes to this projection, right, we don't want to be using Greenwich Mean Time. We don't want to be using a Mercator projection because those are founded in colonialism as much of mapping is. And so like also kind of with this inherently, okay, north has to be on top, right? These foundations of maps that we're taught that are not in fact relevant and are kind of hegemonic when it comes to actually trying to create something that is representative of like a relational space. And so we wanted to try to create a map that, like with this projection and this orientation, the structure of the creation of this map, we want to produce in an anti-colonial way. And so in order to do that, and I'll talk about this in a tiny bit, but we created our own projection, at least with the paper map, and we're kind of playing with how we can even do that maybe with the web map. Another really important thing for them was data sovereignty. So there is a long history at all of the UCs, but specifically Berkeley, on absolute extraction and kind of like desecration of indigenous artifacts and bodies, and specifically like talking about kind of the Hearst Museum at UC Berkeley and the history there. And so a lot of the conversations were about like, how do we create data and how do we keep it safe? Like, how do we not have it embedded in that UC Berkeley, email or title, or like within the system itself that has this history of doing this harm. And so kind of what we're doing is we are actually kind of operating on a sovereign server that we purchased and are creating, and then we're trying to create more data. So specifically, we've got basically there's been this kind of transformation of the Bay Area specifically since like pre-contact. The shoreline of the Bay looked entirely different, and so we've got we're kind of digitizing and creating different data on the shorelines of the bay to incorporate into this map, which is a thing that a bunch of the undergraduates are doing right now, to try to understand where that original shoreline was. Another extremely important part of all of this is that we're kind of coming from a perspective of intentional partiality, right? So this map is specific to Sigorte. It's not something that we're trying to create that is a universal tool, because universality itself is a concept that is inherently colonial and isn't relevant within kind of the indigenizing the map that we're trying to do with this kind of creation of a space that is a specifically partial design that is specific to this location. And that kind of comes into play with this colonial gaze. So we're trying to combat this myth of erasure, this myth that, I'm sure, well, I know I went to public school in the United States, and I'm sure other folks did as well. And this understanding of Indigenous people as in the past is, this map is specifically trying to disrupt that and bring into kind of feeling of going into the, not just the past, but into the present and into the future, and combating these myths of erasure. So let's see. So we are kind of getting onto this realm where we realize that this isn't just a map that we're creating, and in trying to do things in this anti-colonial way, we run into a lot of barriers, especially when it comes to creating projections and using data. And so we're trying to kind of center this map from from Sigorte's own kind of cosmology, and creating cartographies that are representative of that specifically. And so what we did as far as projection goes is, this is kind of an illustration of a tool that one of our PhD students, Eve McGlynn, who was instrumental in creating. And so this is kind of our way of re-projecting. It's pretty interesting, kind of how you can create a projection that's a little bit more deeply relational. And so what we were doing is reprojecting this map by using specific points that we know are really important, and then centering it on asking Sigorte, okay, where do we want this map to be centered on? They chose Lejeune, which was one of the first spaces that they rematriated in East Oakland. And it also is a site of what they believe to be really close to an ancient village site. So I won't get too into the details, but basically, in order to create this projection, we found these specific spots, and we've got the names and the geocoordinates of that spot, all these places that are important in the bay. And then we've got kind of plugging it into this tool with Lejeune at the center, and creating these rings around them, and then changing the parameters of the reflection so that they are kind of relational to each other. And this kind of created this, what we're going to kind of go into next, which is the actual map that we're kind of working with. And it'll make a little bit more sense kind of when we get into that. This is kind of a showcase of the workshopping that it took to do these projections. So you can see here, that's Clancy and Eve, who are actually using, after the tool that I just showed y'all, there's basically was a process where we were trying to factor in the distance between the rings on this massive piece of paper, and then kind of overlaying some different points, and using this projection, once we got it all kind of together again, using an actual projector with this arc underlay and all of this georeferenced information and the raster of the coastlines, etc., moving the projector back and forth to actually move the points and be able to sketch and hand draw these points to each other and like flip the projection out. And you can kind of see a little teaser of our stereographic projection there that Eve and Clancy are working on. Here is a map, some of the maps that we're using for the digitization of the data. So we have 8 undergraduates right now in the research lab whose job it is to georeference all of these old maps on the David Rumsey collection and to try to, we're basically getting as much data together of tracing the shoreline to figure out, okay, where was the shoreline originally? Because it's actually extremely difficult to find. And the reason we're doing that is so we can have that data on the map that we're creating to show kind of contemporary and historical data. So here, this is kind of the first draft of this stereographic projection that we created. So you can see Lejeune is kind of in the center bit of the map. And then up towards the top of the stereographic projection, you can see the opening of the Golden Gate, which is where the Golden Gate Bridge would be. And that little island right there is Alcatraz, which is also extremely important within the realms of the project and to Sigorte as a pretty sacred space. Yeah, so we wanted to kind of basically combine this top-down orthogonal view with this orthographic view of the UC Berkeley Hills. Another thing we're trying to do is mash up all of this kind of information together. So we've got historical coastline, we have contemporary coastlines, and kind of making design choices based on what Sigorte is interested in. So we can talk a little bit more about kind of the work that I'm doing with the project. We basically are trying to create and use like colors from the rematriated spaces themselves. So for instance, I will go down to different spaces that Sigorte runs and work with the folks there doing different gardening projects and taking photos of different textures and colors to then use in our maps, which is kind of what you're seeing right here. We also are trying to show seasonality with stars and constellations. So something I'm also working on is using this tool, just a like pretty simple online tool to be able to tell exactly where stars were in different realms and areas throughout seasons and throughout years, and kind of re-projecting those stars outward. We're gonna be showing kind of 4 different quadrants with those stars in that relational kind of configuration of the stars going around this world that is the map. And you can also see here, we've got pictures of, this is one of Clancy's sketches of monarch butterflies. And we're kind of bringing in local significant ecological systems. So we've got monarch butterflies that are, Sigorte is actually like doing a lot of work within their sites to create spaces for monarchs to come through on their migration paths. And then, but we're also gonna be probably including like a grizzly bear and some different things that were really important parts of that ecosystem that are not here anymore.
Hey, Char, we're out of time. Can you want to wrap it up real quick?
Yeah, so I'll wrap it up really quick. Basically, this is a pretty iterative process, and we're going to be working kind of on this creation of our own sort of big digital map at the, which is probably a pretty long way down the road, but to be able to use our kind of own sovereign servers and counter kind of Esri, Mapbox, and things that those customizations kind of couldn't afford us when we're talking about trying to create this space. So I think, yeah, that's it. We're trying to figure out how would we create a GIS that is grounded in a more anti-colonial and partial view of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Char. That was great. So we have about 2 minutes for questions. I have one question in the chat. The US Census states, join us this month as we celebrate American Indian and Alaska Native Heritage Month and Geography Awareness Week. So it's a question concerning about places to find data on American Indian populations. So possibly a question about the US Census trying to address issues on American Indian census data availability. William, do you want to, did I capture that correctly?
Yeah, that was it. I'd earlier put on a link that I was looking at this morning on US Census and data that's available on it for schools and especially high schools and teachers. So I was wondering how that linked in with what you're doing, or whether it could have a good fit with what you're doing.
Char, would you like to take that question, or would you like?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for the question, William. I'd say that this project that we're working on is very specific to Sigorte. And so we're not really like working with a lot of US Census data around other Indigenous groups. I think it would be a really interesting tool to look into. And I do have obviously reservations about it since it's the government, but I will say that I don't think as a lab and as the work that we're doing that's extremely specific to Sigorte, that tool would really be like the thing that we would be using in this application. And I don't think I can really speak to how we would use it in this application.
Okay. Thank you so much, Char. If anyone has any more questions, me, Char, and Clancy are happy to answer them in the chat as well. So next up we have, oh, wow, I'm deeply disorganized today. Next up we have the UCSD Homelessness Hub. Hello. Can you share your screen for us today?
Zhongqi, you have that. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Julie Wartell, and with me today, part of my team here, as well as part of the Homelessness Hub team, Zhongqi Zheng and Yao Fu. I teach GIS at UC San Diego in the Urban Studies and Planning Department, as well as serve as the GIS manager for the Homelessness Hub. And I think I don't know if I can click. Zhongqi, I'm gonna ask you to click for me. Thank you. So our mission at the Homelessness Hub at UC San Diego is to advance research, education, and policy on housing and homelessness. All sounds great, right? And you're wondering a little bit about why we're here at UC GIS Week presenting. So a little bit of history on this is that about 2.5 years ago, there was a group of academic researchers, so from various colleges and universities throughout San Diego County, that had been meeting for several months with a nonprofit called the Lucky Duck Foundation about kind of coordinating research efforts. I get a text one day from one of my colleagues that said, Julie, can you map where all of the get it done complaints, which are the 311 that people can fill in and say there's a homeless encampment, can you put those on a map? And I said, sure. And 15 minutes later, sent her a map. And then, can you add parks? Can you add bus stops? And I guess in this meeting, everyone's like, wow, no one's looked at this before. So we started talking, and soon after, Lucky Duck Foundation put out a small grant award and said, apply for it. And so we applied as the Homelessness Hub that we would coordinate GIS data and other data, but it was all about the data mapping, spatial analysis of homeless-related issues. And on that note of homeless or homelessness, just wanted to point out that we sometimes use unhoused, we sometimes use people experiencing homelessness. They're all meaning the same thing in this regard. About this past summer, we got an infusion of private money. Super fortunate. We have some great research colleagues that were out there convincing people to expand the homelessness hub. So in addition to the GIS portal, which we started and kind of had a lot of part-time help working on, that we now have expanded beyond the GIS portal to bigger issues of research, education, and policy, and working with others. But GIS is still at the heart of the homelessness hub. So these 4 projects, we've done a lot of different work, but these 4 are our bigger projects that we have used GIS. Our very first project and partner was the San Diego River Park Foundation and People Assisting the Homeless, which is also referred to as PATH. That idea was to do a census of the unhoused living in the San Diego riverbed, and we used Survey 123. So San Diego River Park Foundation had been collecting data on trash and abandoned camps for several years. And then their new partnership with PATH, they said, now we want to go collect data on people. No personal identifying information, just more information about, are there elderly, are there children, are there disabilities, are there COVID-19 pandemic needs? So we worked with them to create the survey and maintain this database. In addition, we have since then taken the mapping and the old data that they had and mapped and analyzed that, looking at trends for them. Those first projects and that partnership led to a study with the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, also known as SQUIRP, and that was about defecation and water testing in the riverbed. So we again worked with our partners to create a survey about defecation habits. And then they tested water, the regular testing that goes on in areas that were highly concentrated with unhoused using the riverbed for defecation. The last 2 projects I'm going to just touch on because that's what Zhongqi and Yao are going to talk about. The Eviction Prevention Collaborative. We use forms, Survey 123, to collect data and then have created a series of maps and dashboards. And then the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies. We've received 2 grants and Yao was one of the lead researchers on these studies. And so we'll talk about that. The last part of mine is just to highlight some of the data that we've collected, and that's been our biggest challenge as anyone using GIS and the previous speakers have talked about the challenges with data. You'd think a lot of this data would just be publicly available. Well, it's not. We've done everything from convert 250-page PDFs into layers and tables to ultimately our best bet is when we have a REST service and we can just link out to data that's already out there in spatial format. So we have lots more data. This is just kind of highlighting the groups of data and some of the layers that we currently have. I'm going to turn it over to Zhongqi at this point.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. You need to switch you're one behind on yours.
Okay. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Zhongqi, and I'm going to talk about the research project Julie just mentioned, evictions in San Diego County. So in our project, we define evictions as the forcible removal of a tenant by the owner or manager of a housing unit, or the voluntary departure of them at the request of the owner or manager. So why eviction will become a critical issue in the homeless is because tenants, especially low-income tenants, are quite vulnerable to those requests, for the language or cultural barriers can prevent them from exerting their legal rights or accessing enough public services. So noticing that, the San Diego Eviction Prevention Collaborative, EPC, and their partners, community-based organizations, CBOs, are working to fill the service gap of eviction prevention work by providing diverse community outreaches. One of those is the Know Your Right workshop, which is from an education purpose to inform tenants of the landlord-tenants laws in San Diego, their right and the prevention they can receive against evictions. It works as a platform as well, where tenants can share their concerns or housing issues that they're currently facing and be connected with those helpful resources. Back to our project, we aimed at building up an eviction prevention database to collect information from individuals who participate in those tenant education programs. It breaks into two parts. The first one is the Know Your Right workshop registration record, which we ask all registrants, no matter of their identity, to fill in the geographic location and demographic information if they're willing to improve their competency for providing us their personal information. We are not asked for any precise location here. We just ask their zip code for our reference. Another part of our project is for a work assessment for the CBO outreach services. So on a monthly basis, the CBO staff will document all the details of their events, like how many people they've reached out, how many workshops they've conducted, so that we have a clear mind of the workload of the project workflow is shown at the bottom of this slide. So we collect data through our GIS Survey 123 by providing forms for each record. After we receive the records, we will process it in the ArcGIS online notebook to do basic data cleaning and assigning the geometry, which is the zip code polygon, to each entry. And then after publishing it as the feature layer and web map, we use ArcGIS dashboard and web experience to visualize it, which you will see in the next slide. And at the end, that's a very important part, another team of Homelessness Hub researcher will evaluate the whole project and write reports for it. So here is an example of our dashboard. This screenshot I took from our workshop registration record dashboard. As you can see, there are multiple indicators here and also charts and web map. For this web map on the right, okay. Here's the legend. So we basically do the registration records by zip code and symbolize it with a graduate color, so that you can see which zip code has the most people to register for this workshop. And on the left side, there's that extendable panel for data filter. So if you go to the dashboard website, you can actually filter the data by selecting the day range or months you're interested in. Or if you are concerning for registration identity, you can filter by tenants, staff member, and property owners. And also, like, if you'd like to assess how those organizations work, if you click on their name, it will tell you like how many people they referred in this workshop. So in general, how could dashboard help? Is it can be a very powerful visual representation to understand the real-time state of those anti-eviction programs, but more importantly, based on where workshop registrations and people receive outreach services are, and along with their demographic information, CBO staff and EPC program operators can tailor the service to reach previously unreached populations, which we can further promote the whole eviction prevention work. So here's my brief demonstration of how we turn data into action for the services. And I will let Zheng have the stage.
Thanks, Zhongqi. As Julie touched on briefly, I'll be talking about public transit and people experiencing homelessness. Next slide, please. So the topic of public transit and people experiencing homelessness can evoke mixed emotions. However, the goal of our project on transit and homelessness at Homelessness Hub was not to explore these emotions. Rather, it was to explore how policies impacted people experiencing homelessness. We took the perspective of people experiencing homelessness as active users of public transit services, just like any other transit customer. This is important to note as previous works in the field have looked at people experiencing homelessness as merely idling aboard transit vehicles or on transit authority property. So indeed, people experiencing homelessness use public transit for many of the same reasons as you or I would, visiting friends or family, attending important meetings, or going to work or school. So while our project looked at transit agency policies and their impact on people experiencing homelessness in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles County, the bulk of our work focused on San Diego County. Now, with that being said, we saw very similar patterns throughout all three regions of California. Next slide, please. So now I'll just quickly go over some of the barriers that people experiencing homelessness face while using transit services. Some of these barriers are very similar to the barriers that you or me would face. For example, infrequent service makes travel less convenient and more time dependent. So you're bound to the transit schedule, making travel less flexible. In addition to making travel less convenient, limited hours of operation may impose time constraints on activities we wish to do. For example, if one works an early or late shift, they can't rely on public transit to get them to work on time. Sparse service coverage means long walks to and from transit stops, exacerbating the first and last mile problems. This makes transit less viable and less competitive as a transportation alternative. So however, some of these transit barriers are unique to people experiencing homelessness. For example, the topic of homelessness is highly stigmatized, and people experiencing homelessness face negative stigma coming from their fellow transit customers. This is reflected in surveys administered by transit authorities to their customers, which suggest people experiencing homelessness to be synonymous with issues of safety, cleanliness, and the like. It's important to remember that people experiencing homelessness are just that. They're people, just like you and me, but they're going through an unprecedented series of events, each in each of their own situation. Thus, while a person may be experiencing homelessness, they may not fit the stereotypes given to the homeless population at large. Next slide, please. I won't go over the details of our research since that would take far too long. However, I do want to highlight our recommendations. In the end, we came up with a trifecta of recommendations to improve transit, not only for people experiencing homelessness, but for all transit customers. These include increased outreach for people experiencing homelessness, particularly in transit environments. Current examples of this can be seen at the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority and at the San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District. Additionally, we recommend improving transit service through increased transit frequency, service span, and route coverage. We emphasize creating a reliable and efficient transit system for all customers. Similarly, we also recommend reducing the cost barrier for those who cannot afford to pay. This may include expanding reduced or free fare programs and making them more easy to actually obtain. Next slide, please. Okay, enough messing about. Let's get to the sauce, shall we? This spatial analysis shows the location of people experiencing homelessness and homeless shelters in relation to transit priority areas. So the map on the right shows the location of people experiencing homelessness from the 2020 point in time count, which is an annual enumeration of all the people experiencing homelessness, and it's done all across the country. And on the left, we have the location of a select number of shelters based on some criteria, such as the size of the shelter, but also like the public availability of the location address. Some of these shelters house victims of domestic violence, for example, and thus their location is not publicly available. Next slide, please. And then these two maps show the same people experiencing homelessness in the same shelters, but now in relation to all transit stops, a quarter-mile buffer around all transit stops. Here we found that the mean distance for a person on the point in time count to a transit stop is approximately 200 meters, and the mean distance to a shelter from a transit stop was approximately 120 meters. Next slide, please. So while the spatial analysis shows an interesting pattern, I must note a few key points. The spatial proximity of people experiencing homelessness to public transit doesn't necessarily mean that one brings about another. This clustering may have more to do with the areas that transit actually serves. So for example, transit doesn't serve the vast majority of residential housing estates in San Diego, but it does serve the central business district, where there are activities or services for people experiencing homelessness. Also, the clustering we see in people experiencing homelessness may be due to the human element. So people experiencing homelessness are a diverse group with social relations and daily routines, much like you and me. So while these are important theories to consider, they are beyond the scope of our research, but they are nevertheless key aspects to consider when thinking about people experiencing homelessness and public transportation. And that concludes our presentation. Thanks.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. I think we're at time, but I can slide in one question if, you know, it's done in a speedy amount of time. Clancy?
Hey, great presentation. I just had a question that I am not going to be able to type out. So weirdly, Alexis and I are also doing another project with houseless communities in Oakland. One of the issues that we've constantly come across is not only just the fact that so many base maps offered in GIS kind of stem from the cadastral data kind of history of urban mapping, but also that the polygons themselves don't actually often meld very well with the kinds of mobilities experienced by people who are houseless. So like a zip code kind of matters much more if you have a house than if you don't. And so we're just wondering, like, how are you dealing with those tensions? Because we're stumped. We're writing a paper about how stumped we are. So I'd be keen to hear your experiences.
It's a great question. And, you know, one of the many data challenges, I think it depends on the different efforts. We have found that Survey 123 has been amazing for that, like the riverbed, which you can't have zip codes. And, you know, our research working with them has shown that the point in time count is missing so many people that live in the riverbed or live down in the area in Chula Vista that's all hidden. So that is one answer, that depending on what the data, but then like the survey data that Zhongqi showed in the dashboards, because that's registration for workshops, they're only asking for zip codes. And so in addition to, I mean, I think, again, it kind of comes down to what are you looking to study? And to kind of end that, and happy to talk to you, would love to talk to you further about this. The Downtown Partnership, which is San Diego's essentially downtown business association, have for 10 years gone out with paper maps and drawn a V for people in vehicles, a T for people in tents. And we offered to like go out there and use this automated data. And then they hand count and put out neighborhood stats every month. And so we finally just met with them again, and they seem more receptive now. We also are working with a guy here in San Diego that had some students digitize all those, well, not all of them, but several years of those maps. And so we have a group of grad students, computational social science, that may take on the project there. So it's a kind of a data nightmare, but yeah, that's what, you know, we know that not all neighborhoods, not all zip codes are equally affected. And so as specific data without, you know, violating any PII is what we aim to do also.
Thank you so much, everyone.
If we're done, Alexis, I just want to add that if you want to continue the conversation, please go ahead and do that in our Slack channel. And our final session for UC GIS Week and for today is at 1 o'clock, and it's GIS plus Aquatic Worlds. So if you can join us, we hope to see you there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.